Welcome to the School Governance Network, where today we're going to be looking at news through the lens of the boardroom. As always, I'm joined by my partner in crime, Paul Smith from the Future Directors Institute. Paul, hey, can you give us a little bit of an introduction for those that are newly joining our network here?
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul. The Future Directors Institute is all about creating next generation boardrooms that are solving big problems with ease. So we're working with directors, aspiring directors and boards to give them the tools and the techniques to help them to work together, work collaboratively on these big problems.
Great. And myself, I'm a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant, a contracted PD coordinator for the ACAMIS Association, which is largely in Mongolia, China, Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. I specialize in the areas of strategy and governance and leadership development. And, today actually really affects all three areas when we talk about the coronavirus. And the theme of today's discussion is really, what questions should you as a board member be asking management as well as yourselves? What kind of questions do we need to be putting out there, not only just to clarify, but to really add perspective? And I think that's probably one of the most important things a board can do, is really bring perspective. Paul, on that point, before we start getting into the news, is there any other expectations you want to set for this newscast?
No, I think it's beyond giving perspective. It's really discussing what is the role of the boardroom in a crisis like this. This is a major global crisis, and we're yet to see, with a lot of uncertainty, and we sort of have been here before. So it's a case of, I think, today discussing what are things that boards should be doing, what's their short-term versus long-term role, and again, like, what questions should they be asking?
Yeah, great. And just like you said, we have been here before. We were here, at least for the schools in Asia that I predominantly serve. We were here in 2003 with SARS. We were here again, even in the 2008 financial crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how those two things are similar in terms of how you can prepare for this now, the coronavirus. But hey, let's take a look at some of the news that's driving the conversation. One thing that I love sharing with schools is this newsletter, which is updated almost daily from the OT&P clinic in Hong Kong. Normally these newsletters tend to be very self-promotional, but this one is beautifully written. Everyone I've shared it with don't even really get the sense that they're promoting. What they're really doing is they're educating. And just even what we're looking at here in terms of this newsletter, they're helping us understand the difference between the disease process and the epidemic process. They even put forward some really good questions. What will happen to me if I get sick? And how likely am I to get sick? Distinguishing between those two is incredibly important. And I think for schools, here's like the first couple questions they need to be asking. How likely are people in our community to get sick? Because that drives obviously the types of preparing they need to do, contingency planning. And if they do get sick, how are we going to address that? We had, just throwing out here, there was a case with the school that I'm working with where they had a corona scare. One of their facility employees, I'm just trying to remember correctly, I believe she was a housekeeper. Her husband worked in a hospital as well as a housekeeper. And he came down, had a fever, got sick. Everybody started worrying about coronavirus. She did the most appropriate thing. She told the school saying, hey, my husband's sick. They think it might be coronavirus. He's being quarantined. Realizing that this could impact her employment status, she still came forward and shared that. And within 24 hours, the school had to make a decision. In this process, there were some people that were like, we have to close immediately. And there were others that had experience with SARS that basically said, wait, hold on, let's make sure we get all the right information before we start raising alarm bells. That voice of reason ended up winning out in this case because the husband ended up didn't having corona. But being educated at this level, like what OT&P is doing, I think is incredibly important so that you can make those decisions and understand, the epidemic process.
Can I just jump in there, Michael? I think this is, again, beyond the first two questions you should be asking or looking at, it also lends itself to the culture within the boardroom. You know, there's a few things here you should be looking for potentially as a board, and this will be our advice to you as a board. Where is that expertise in the room? Where is that past knowledge in the room? You know, we talk about at Future Directors about blending great boardroom blends the wisdom of experience with the wisdom of inexperience, so different perspectives. I think often people coming in here who may be in the boardroom who would have gone through SARS, GFC, at a school board level or a corporate level, whatever it happens to be, that's great to see what they went through, but also they have to have the lens of, hold on, what worked, what didn't work, but also, is this the same? I think a lot of people who went through SARS are going, okay, this will blow over like SARS did. But again, we have to also understand we have uncertainty here.
Yeah.
I think the next thing there is potentially, and one of the things that boards struggle with a lot is vulnerability to ask for help if you don't actually have that expertise in the room. There's nothing wrong with reaching out and going, you know what, we don't know, but we don't know yet. So the role of the board is to take that off potentially leadership or work with leadership and go, okay, what can we be finding out to support what's going on to make sure we've got all the right perspectives coming in? But we got to make sure then that lends itself to preparing for next time. And that's especially if there's a next time when people are around, but then that knowledge is actually being passed on in some way. And finally, for me, who's the calm person in the room? Again, it lends itself to the culture. Who's the one with one of my favorite words, equanimity, which is like calmness in a crisis. It's got Lisa Jones. Let's look for them for inspiration, because it is easy to sort of read the news, get into a bubble, start panicking, you know, whatever it happens to be. And again, these are all very natural reactions, and start stressing out and going with quick solutions which aren't informed or well thought out. And again, it happens. And often though, you do have to toss a coin and go with it, right? So I get the need for quick decisions, but let's look for inspiration from the calm people in the room to actually spread that across. Let's lean into those people, because these are the times when we need that. Just if I may, a global board I sit on, every 2 years we have an international congress in Europe. 50 people from 30 countries get together. This was started to be planned a year ago. So imagine, and then at the end of last year, we were pretty much finalized our agenda, travel plans, the whole thing. Then this struck, and then our Chinese colleagues couldn't come, then Hong Kong, and now whilst others can come, progressively we've got a reduced size, and then it's the risk. And then our founder, who's 86, didn't want to come. There was a whole thing about super spreaders, and we basically now transitioned, and this was only 3 days ago, for something that starts next week, into a fully online congress with a reduced agenda. But we've had to adjust as we go, because if we'd made a decision early on and it had gone somewhere else, we could have made the wrong decision. But if we weren't doing this and looking at the news and keeping on top of the advice and getting advice from all the right quarters, we've just had to completely change what we're doing. But it shows we leaned into help. We leaned into other people. We didn't panic. There was a lot of stuff going around saying we should stop, we should do this, we should do this. There's a lot of people going, we should do this, we should do that. I think the thing was that we just kept calm and went through a process we would do with any other type of initiative. Make sure we're informed, make sure we're making the right decisions, make sure we're communicating effectively and consistently. That's all I wanted to share.
All right, great. And, you know, and again, it's like, who's the calm person, right? And when we don't have expertise, where can we find it? One thing to kind of add to that in terms of news, a really interesting story came out. There was a school in Hong Kong that governor worked in a company, or had an executive role in the company, and that company actually invited one of the lead researchers from HKU during the SARS virus to help them understand, how is this different and similar to the SARS virus, and will the response be different or similar? So here you had actually a governor sitting on a board that, you know, was from a company where the company had invested a lot of resources in understanding this process. Again, shared anecdote, but there's so many resources you have out there once you start actually feeling out for them. Another additional piece of news that I want to bring up is it's not just the health and welfare of our community, but it's also, you know, there's the economic concerns that we probably have in terms of, you know, are we going to be losing staff next year because of the scare, because we're in a region that was heavily affected, say China. Are, you know, based on the supply chain within China, and especially if you're a China school and you're thinking back to that financial crisis in 2008, where there was a huge exodus of expats and students, you know, how is that going to impact us? You know, Paul raised earlier a question in terms of this idea of what can we learn from the past instances? You know, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? If we had the chance to do it all over again in 2003 or 2008, what would we do differently? So here are some other key questions we need to be asking. And if for whatever reason your board or your management do not have people from that period, you need to go back and find them. So it's not just about reaching out outside your board for consultants. Let's go back and tap into the institutional memory of people that were there at that particular time, because that could be a real great resource to helping you understand how your community reacted to some of the things that happened back then. So don't discount that sort of that perspective, even though that person has already left your community. Hey, Paul, any additional thoughts on the economic fallout from all this?
Well, I've only really got examples at the moment. I've got some really good examples from Australia, and mostly at the university level rather than the school level, because Australia instituted a travel ban very early on. Actually, I think it was the first country to have a travel ban from mainland China, which has obviously served its well to start with. But the economic impact on university school term had already started before that. So the international students were already in, but university term only started last week. And, you know, here's some stats. You know, Chinese students make up about 20% of most universities' total revenue. We look at, say, the Sydney University, there's 15,000 Chinese visa holders, half of which are still overseas. You know, that won't have changed because Australia were only letting citizens or residents back. And apparently the funding shortfall for a group like that is potentially 300 million. And again, they, as a university, won't know how long this is going to happen. You know, they can't lobby government to have these things changed. They potentially are, you know, moving to an online platform to deliver, you know, the learnings and the lessons and tutorials and one-on-one with tutors. But again, they're also struggling with which platform to use because of access in China. So there's a massive economic impacts here alone. And, you know, that's almost 200,000 tertiary students from China in Australia. And to give you context of how important that is for Australia, there's only 360,000 in the US. So about twice as many Chinese university students in the US to Australia for a country which is, I don't know what, 10 to 15 times the size, population-wise. It's amazing impact.
So for any of our schools that are reliant on that demographic or that student, you know, that's an eye-opener in terms of how we might be impacted. Now, there's a lot of concern, even though schools have probably been really working through this for the last 3-4 weeks, you know, and they might have made sense of a lot of things. There's still probably a lot of questions that need to be asked. And what I want to do is I want to share with you a resource from ACAMIS, the association that I work with, just to let you know that within these associations, there's some great information and experience you can tap into that shouldn't cost you anything. So if you do belong to these networks, use them. If you're not speaking to other heads of school, start talking to them. You need to start working with them regularly. That's probably the best piece of advice that we can give at this particular time if you're playing catch up. So in this respect, key questions to ask: hey, what networks do we have that we can tap into to be getting information and to understand what other schools are doing, so we can at least benchmark ourselves? Just based on this Acumus advisory, this information, update number 3, something they're doing regularly, doing a great job doing it. Tom Olmert, who's the executive director for Acumus, he was around during SARS, he was around during all the different coronavirus scares, as well as the 2008 financial crisis. So he and his friends and peers, they're able to really reflect on those times, come together and be able to put together these advisories. It's really important to note that during times like this, you need to keep your board calm. So if you're from the management perspective, make sure to take time to be constantly updating them and keeping them in the loop about things that are going on. You don't need to give them the big or all the information. Distill it down to the main points so that they're prepared just in case somebody were to come up to them, email them, call them, because a lot of our governors are actually members of our community. So the more information they have, the better they can support you, and vice versa. Board members, I've already said it, if you have that opportunity to share information about what your company is doing, that's going to be incredibly powerful to your management. Paul, before I kind of go on with the rest of my list, anything else you want to add about perspective and information sharing?
Yeah, I think it's sort of what you said about working with management. This is where the board needs to show extreme patience and extreme support. You know, obviously there's a regular agenda and there's other items that are happening, but in times like this, management's focus is going to be narrowed into a few big things, and that's delivering to children and keeping everybody in the loop. And the board will have to, you know, any other big projects, or the board are either going to have to take on or sort of be patient. And this is a great time. There's going to be a lot of stress happening here, so a great time for board to practice that sort of patience. But also, whilst management is distracted, probably not the right word, but you know what I mean. This is the good time for whilst the board are learning and asking the right questions and being patient, this is a good time for them to be getting the risk register back on the agenda and starting to look at the other risks that we can and cannot foresee, and what we might do for next time, or what we might do for that particular type of risk. You know, we're in a risk culture right now, so let's start focusing our attentions on that medium to long term. That's our role, whilst we support the short term.
Yeah. So like protocols and policies do we have now for similar risks? If we don't have them, well, that's obviously giving us some sort of clue that we need to start developing them. And this is the best time to start doing it while the experience is live. You know, here's another one the schools are dealing with, and I'm hearing from lots of heads of school, and I was just working through this issue with a head last week: refund policies. Yes, parents are asking for money back because, hey, I pay my kid to go to school, they're not in school. I don't really feel the virtual medium is the same as the in-class medium, and this is very unfair to schools. But at the same time, there are just parents that value it based on, you know, their child being there. When I was speaking to another head of school, we started looking at this issue, and I asked them, well, hey, do you have a force majeure clause in your contracts or agreements with parents? And, you know, he reflected and said, I got one for the staff, but I don't want to have one for the parents. So this is something we got to catch up on. And so some advice I gave him is like, look, the last thing you want to tell a parent is what you can't do. You need to be telling them what you can do. And we came around to a few ideas of things that he could be doing, the school could be doing, and summer school came up. Well, hey, if we're going to be valuing school based on the number of days, especially when there's this ambiguity around, like, you know, what are we getting for our money? Is it based on the content and curriculum, or is it based on the number of days in school? Well, what you can do is offer a compromise that also reassures those parents that your child is going to be entering the school year next year with everything they need to be successful next year. So the base concern here is not that we're not getting what we paid for. The base concern here is, well, The base, yeah, we could say they're not getting what they paid for, which is the education of their child, right? But it's not based on the number of days that child is educated in a classroom. It's based on what skills and knowledge they come out of at the end of the year to help them get a start into the next year. So for those parents that are worried, is summer school an option? Can we have that option available for those parents that are really concerned about that? Because not every parent's going to take it, and not every teacher is going to want to teach it. But there are parents that will want it, and there are teachers that are willing to teach it, which kind of brings me to my next point. For those teachers that are willing to teach it, we might have to incentivize them with a little extra money. And to run the school, we might have to keep other staff in place and have our catering arrangements there. But for schools that have their reserve funds, that have healthy reserve funds, or any reserve funds for that matter, that's why we have them. So we can dip into it at times like this and invest in our community to allay those concerns. So you do have tools that you can use. How you want to plan for it and how you actually implement it is what you should be doing now. That way you can be telling parents what you can do, not what you can't do. Paul, any further thoughts on the can do and the can't do?
No, I think you covered that nicely.
All right, great. And so, moving on and thinking about reserves, well, obviously we have reserves because we've been very good at financial planning. But a big part of that financial planning is our enrollment. Well, I think it's safe to say that we could plan to take a hit, especially in Asia, where people are concerned about, safety, welfare, how the government's handling things. It's quite possible there are going to be a lot of parents looking for boarding school options. And when we think about enrollment, this is going to present challenges and opportunities. Challenges are, all right, how many students do we need to prepare that are going to be, leaving? How's that going to affect our budget? For those that are really worried about that, I want to come back to 2003 and 2008. There were a lot of schools that were obviously really concerned about that. And the worst thing that happened is, for the next few years, they had a much smaller enrollment. But many of the schools that I worked with, they were able to get back to near or the same enrollment that they had, depending on their particular situation. Now in 2008, though, coming out of 2008, it was a different sort of market because there were a lot of schools coming in at that same time to fill demand. And predominantly for local students or those that were returning back to China or to Asia because it was developing economically. So they might have been losing expats, but there was a huge gain in terms of more of the local students. So the return for them from 2008 was actually a little bit more difficult because they were facing competition, not from the fact that there weren't students. So let's reassess what your market's going to look like. How is it affecting all schools? Are these challenges or opportunities? Because if you're a boarding school, hey, there's opportunities. If you are, a regular school, no boarding program, how is this going to impact your bottom line? Two things to think about. Number one, yeah, bottom line is important. How long are your reserves? How long can you weather it if all things stayed equal? But be also thinking, there was a very, very good CFO for a large school that I worked with in China, and he probably had the best advice to offer, is that, you know what? The financial crisis came and it hurt us. We were a school of, X number. We lost, I got to be mindful about the how many number of students I said, because then people would be able to figure out the school. So I'm not trying to cheat you guys here, but they were a school of X number. They lost 25% of their students over a 2-year period because of the financial crisis. But this CFO said, hey, be calm. Take it as it comes, and also be prepared for the fact that you're not just going to be losing students, but there's going to be a certain natural attrition within your teaching body as well, that you're going to be having a certain number of teachers that are also going to be leaving, and that's going to balance things out to some degree. There's other changes that you as a school can make programmatically as well, which isn't going to affect your base offering. Sure, you might lose a few CCAs here and there, but for the most part, you will be able to ensure that same continuity. You just got to stay focused on it and stay in contact with your community so that you can be better apprised of what's happening. So, in closing, there's not just challenges, but there's potential opportunities to also sharpen your model so that you can weather these types of crises in the future. And by sharpening your model, your business model, what I'm talking about is, what is your continuity plan? How can you improve your virtual teaching strategies for the next time this crisis might come around? How can you improve your risk mitigation strategies, policies, and protocols for the next time this comes around? So there's opportunities in here to grow. Paul, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I wanted to build on that slightly. I was just busily making some notes here to remind me, like, whilst the health and well-being is paramount financially, we talk about the international schools as businesses, the way you handle, as a school, the way you handle and your ability to handle this effectively, communicate effectively, will actually set you up well in the future, because I think parents will be looking to schools, especially in the short term while this is still fresh, assuming that we do, we are reaching a peak and we fall off, if we start falling away and we start either moving past this or incorporating this in some way and life goes back to normal, the schools that have done this the best, have effectively managed their stakeholders, communications, whatever, will be set up well, because they'll be the more attractive schools going forward. Because I think people are going to be in a risk culture again. They're thinking, I want to send my child to a school that's got this covered, whether that is a boarding or a non-boarding school. And also, also understandings for schools. Japan is closing down schools. One of the things I noticed from the document you shared from that group was talking about closing campuses, not closing the school. So the school is still open for business and still open for learning, but it's delivering its lessons in a different way. And again, communication is absolutely critical here. It needs to be honest but informative. And you're looking at what's happening in Italy, and France, where they're shutting down public gatherings. We've still a long way to go here. But again, as I said, just on the financial front, trying to think, if you weather this well and set this up properly, you're going to be more attractive going forward. And that's obviously a critical part of your business plan going forward.
Great. Well, Paul, thank you again for joining me for this look at the news through the lens of the boardroom. This has been, for me, it's been great to be able to share experience about what's happening on the ground. Paul, it's great to get your perspective and feedback as well, especially as it pertains to the work that you're doing with boards. For all of you that are new to our network, please look out for us in LinkedIn and join our LinkedIn group, the School Governance Network. That's where we post videos like this, as well as articles and other blogs, comments. Please also be on the lookout for us because, hey, exciting news. We got invited to speak for the FARIA group about the coronavirus, and they're going to be preparing a webinar in the next few weeks where we're going to go into much more detail about things like the risk register and the types of questions that need to be asked. So we'll be really excited to have you join us during that time as well. So for here, from where I'm at, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Paul, thank you for your contributions, and we look forward to seeing you next time.